This is Chris Isham, the Washington Bureau Chief for CBS News, and this is Flashpoints. And I'm here, as always, with Juan Zarate, our Chief National Security Advisor. Welcome, Juan.
Thank you, Chris. Great to see you.
Let's talk a little bit about the Patriot Act and the National Security Agency. The Patriot Act expires, on June 1 in a couple of weeks. In jeopardy here is a specific clause which has been interpreted by the National Security Agency to allow for the collection of metadata, the so-called data which is connected with phone calls, not the content of the calls, but the number that was called from, and the origin and the destination of the phone calls.
Exactly.
Now that expires in 2 weeks, and the Congress is now debating where it's going to go and whether they will continue to authorize the National Security Agency to collect this data. Right. What's at stake here? What's the big picture?
Well, what's at the heart of your question is whether or not the programs that the NSA has built into and from the architecture of the Patriot Act, in particular Section 215, which provides the authority, the NSA argues, for the telephony metadata collection that you described, whether or not that is going to survive. And that was already in debate, and with some modifications, with certain senators and members of Congress arguing for just a clean reauthorization, others saying, look, we've got to modify and constrain post-Snowden what the NSA is really doing in terms of collection on a mass scale.
Americans are rightly concerned about having all of their phone.
In the middle of this comes the bombshell of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that the use of Section 215 to legitimate this mass collection of telephone metadata is actually unlawful. That is unlawful, and that contradicts the FISA court rulings, contradicts the very legal baseline from which the NSA has collected this data.
So in order to continue this program, Congress would have to specifically authorize the collection of this metadata. So
that's right. So does Congress now have to refashion Section 215 to actually authorize the NSA program? And what's at stake here is if Congress can't come to an agreement and the Second Circuit ruling holds, it isn't overturned by the Supreme Court and is honored, then you have potentially the NSA having to abandon this program because it does not have a legal basis, at least under the Patriot Act, to collect. And so the program's at risk, the very contours of the Patriot Act's at risk, and the question on the legal basis of how you collect metadata is actually now at risk a bit as well.
So there are a lot of issues that are in play here which need to be resolved in a couple of weeks, which, knowing how the Congress operates, could be quite a challenge.
Quite a challenge. It was already complicated in the post-Snowden environment. Lots of interest on the far right, far left around restricting this program. Lots of interest to continue it from the moderate middle of both the Republican and Democratic sides. But now you have the complication of how do you actually legally justify this program outside the bounds of the Patriot Act as it currently sits.
Now, one of the proposals I've seen is that they would require the National Security Agency to file a warrant under a FISA court warrant, that the metadata itself would be held by the phone companies, and then the National Security Agency would file a warrant for that information. Is that workable, do you think?
It's workable to a certain extent. I think this is something that President Obama has talked about as well, having the telephone companies hold the data and then you interrogate it one sort of interrogation at a time as opposed to having it collected and then analyzing it. That certainly slows the process. That builds a requirement that there's actually something very specific about that piece of metadata before you inquire. Currently what you have is all that metadata kind of in a soup, and you interrogate it tied to information you have connected to a terrorist actor or a terrorist phone number.
So in other words, if you get a number of a known terrorist bad guy in, say, Yemen,
right,
and he makes a phone call to the United States, you have the ability to do that now, to track that phone
right,
call.
and to know where it's hitting. It doesn't allow you to listen to it or to see into it. You then have to go get a warrant to do that. But if you disentangle the aggregation of the data, it begins to create some technical problems and some inefficiencies. Now, some would argue, look, it's worth the inefficiencies. We want to protect at least the perception of privacy and civil liberties. Others would say, look, housing the data with telephone companies really doesn't protect anything. in part because that can be hacked into, it can be accessed by litigants, so it actually, exacerbates the problems you have with privacy and civil liberties. So all of these fundamental debates, which are already underway, are now being complicated by this Second Circuit ruling. And it's going to be a real challenge and test of Congress to see if they can balance what is a really serious question for our national security.
And this is all occurring at a time when the director of the FBI the other day said that there are thousands of people here in the United States that are being influenced by radical Islamism and by the Islamic State in particular. So.
And as well, at a time when the FBI director and others have worried about further encryption technologies that will not give them access to data, even if you have this program, that there are new technologies emerging and that technology companies are purposely developing to not allow access to law enforcement. So that in and of itself adds another dimension as the technology evolves. And so in some ways we're debating about this old program, and the technology is outstripping where we are.
Okay, well, interesting questions, and I'm sure we'll be watching that over the next few weeks in Congress. Thank you, Juan.
Thanks,
and this is Flashpoints. We'll see you next time.